The first time I ever led Sunday morning worship was on this particular Sunday, the last Sunday of the Epiphany, year B, 9 years ago, back at St. David's in Bean Blossom, Indiana. And some of you have heard me talk before about St. David's in Bean Blossom. It was my home parish as an adult. It was the parish that sponsored me for ordination. And it's this wonderful, simple little church in this wonderful, simple little crossroads town with this simple, down-to-earth worship. And in some ways, not that different from St. Martha's. And many of you met the vicar, Jonathan, when Jonathan and Deborah were here a couple times over the last couple years to give concerts. And you remember that he's sort of the quintessential guitar-toting parson with the long gray beard and the fact that he and Deborah actually did make their living as traveling folk musicians living out of the back of a VW microbus before he went to seminary. I mean, he's that kind of priest, and it's that kind of place. Simple, down to earth. Well, this fateful week, 9 years ago, I got a call on a Tuesday night from Coral, who was a member of the congregation who lived in the cabin next door to Jonathan and Deborah, and she told me that Jonathan's mother had just died and that he and the family were going back to Pennsylvania for the funeral. And she said she was going to try to find a supply priest, but if she couldn't, would I be willing to preach and lead morning prayer? And I said, of course, that's the least I can do. I mean, it felt like something that I could offer, something I could do for my friend in his time of need. And quite honestly, I was pretty sure she was going to be able to find a supply priest. I thought it was an offer I could make and not have to follow through on. But you know where this story's headed, right? Coral called back later in the week to say she'd been through the whole list, couldn't find anybody to preside, and would I please lead morning prayer? And I said, okay. And I opened up the prayer book and started looking at the morning prayer service. And I started thinking, and that was my first mistake. At that point, I had only just started seminary classes. I had preached maybe once or twice to small groups. I don't think I had ever been to a service of morning prayer, let alone led one. At that point, we weren't doing morning prayer at St. David's. We weren't doing it in a lot of places. It's set up to be the daily worship of the church, but it's really pretty complicated because it is set up for every day. Every stop, there's 10 different choices and 20 different menus to choose from, and it's really complicated to plan, and I started to get worried. I started to think about how simple and straightforward the regular Sunday Eucharistic worship was, and how Jonathan made it look so easy, and how I didn't have the option if I got lost to just pick up my guitar and start strumming. I was really getting nervous, and I was afraid I was going to make a fool of myself. I was afraid everybody was going to be watching me and judging me, and if that wasn't weird enough, it was about to get weirder. I thought back to my field ed and remembered I had done field ed in a very high church Anglo-Catholic place in downtown Indianapolis, and I remembered Father Stephen lecturing the sacristans on the importance of the symbolism of correct vestments. And so I went back to my notes and I saw that the correct vestment for a lay leader leading morning prayer is cassock and surplice, tippet optional. Well, remember I said St. David's was a simple place, an easygoing place. I doubt that cassock and surplice and tippet had been seen within the bounds of Brown County since the beginning of time. No one would have known what I was doing. No one would have recognized me. This was the kind of place that maybe saw a chasuble Christmas and Easter if Jonathan was in the right mood. Here I was making plans to borrow a cassock and surplice from somebody so I could be correct, so I could somehow embody the correctness of morning prayer. Well, thankfully, at that point, I got an email from my friend Pamela. She was the head of the worship committee, and she was writing to let me know what hymns she'd picked for that Sunday, and she just innocently said, "Is there anything I can do to help you?" She had no idea what she was walking into. I responded with this email about, oh my God, about cassocks and surplices and hymns and anthems and bulletins and preachings, and oh my gosh, what are we going to do, Pamela? And true to form, Pamela hauled me back in off the ledge, and she wrote, you know, in the readings, Jesus keeps telling us to pay attention to the reality right in front of us, Tim. So pay attention to reality. It's still Sunday morning in Bean Blossom, sweetie. And indeed, it was still Sunday morning in Bean Blossom, and it is still Sunday morning on Trent Boulevard. Reality is right here. No matter how much we may get sidetracked in the details, no matter how much we may try to turn the focus onto ourselves and our issues and our concerns, Jesus keeps telling us, look at the reality right in front of you. Now, I wish I could say that that little fashion crisis was a one-time event, but unfortunately it seems to be part of who I am and part of how I deal with things. I remember when my first grandma died, and all of her friends gathered at the house, and everybody was having fellowship and baked goods, of course. And I became obsessed with keeping the house absolutely clean. And I got this obsession about coffee cups on the end tables, so that I would hardly let a coffee cup touch the table before I would grab it, and I would have it back in the kitchen and washed and dried and back in the cupboard before this poor woman even realized she was done drinking coffee. I was just focused on the coffee cups. And I know that this is a control issue. I know that this control issue was about fear. This was about looking for something that I could control. I could control coffee cups. I could control end tables. But this was a situation where I was painfully aware that I couldn't control much else. Somebody I loved very deeply had just died, and it reminded me how little control we have in the world. Cassocks and bulletins and hymns were something I felt like I could control at a time when I was realizing that I couldn't do very much for my friend in his grief. Now, this sort of little spaz out is one of the reasons I identify so much with Peter and the apostles in Mark's Gospels. Poor Peter, bless his heart, he loves Jesus so deeply and so desperately wants to do the right thing and say the right thing, but over and over again, he manages to speak when he really should keep his mouth shut and to rush forward when he really should be holding his horses. And the rest of the disciples, they manage to just not get it so spectacularly over and over again throughout this gospel, to focus on themselves, to focus on side issues, to focus on trivia, when Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, is right there in front of them. And that's the one thing they manage to miss. A few verses before today's gospel, Peter has gotten it right for once. Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter immediately blurts out, "You are the Messiah." And then in the next verse, when Jesus starts talking about the necessity for the Messiah to die, for the necessity of the Messiah to suffer, Peter tries to correct him. Peter tries to shut him up. The plain talk about the reality of the pain and suffering that's to come is too much for Peter, too much reality for Peter. And he tries to shut it out, sort of the equivalent of covering his ears and going, la, 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 I don't hear you. And now in today's gospel, 6 days later, Jesus shows Peter and John and James this very beautiful but very difficult and very big piece of reality. He shows them himself, transfigured, changed into this form that allows them to see him as he truly is in all of his cosmic glory, as the continuation and fulfillment of the law and the prophets of Israel, as Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, all of this coming together in this beautiful scene on the mountaintop. Jesus shows his friends this piece of reality that's beautiful but really big and really hard to get a hold of, that this simple Galilean peasant, this friend of theirs, is the Son of God. And so what do the disciples do? They spaz out. They freak out. They're terrified. What they have seen is just way too difficult for them to deal with. Too much to take in. And so good old Peter starts babbling about something that he can control, something he knows a little bit about. Let's start a building campaign. We'll build 3 booths up here. We'll build 3 dwellings, one for you and one for Moses and Elijah, and maybe a monument over here and a visitor center and a gift shop. It'll be great, Jesus. Peter is looking for something he knows how to do, something that he can control and get his arms around, like washing coffee cups. Now, the author of the gospel seems to acknowledge that what Peter has to say is a bit of a non sequitur. Doesn't make much sense. Because he writes, he didn't know what to say, for they were terrified. And Jesus and the voice from heaven of God the Father don't even bother to respond to Peter's goofy suggestion. They just roll right over it. And the voice from the cloud says, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Listen. Look at the reality right in front of your face. Listen, this is important. Yo, Peter, quit fooling around and pay attention. Again, as they're going down the mountain and they're starting to talk to one another, Jesus tells them, be quiet, don't talk, stop babbling, don't tell anyone about this, we don't need to talk about it. In the face of big, difficult reality that seems too big to handle, it's worth remembering to be quiet, to listen. As a people, we seem to be deathly afraid of silence. But listening in silence may be exactly what we need to get us to pay attention to reality. Big, difficult reality, like the incarnation. Big, difficult reality, like the passion, like the resurrection. In our first reading, God comes to Elijah the prophet at a low point in his career. He's being chased by the armies of Jezebel and Ahab. He's looking like it's the end of the road for him. He is in such bad straits that just a few verses ago he's asked God, please just let me die. I don't want to do this anymore. Well, God comes to Elijah. God comes to Elijah in that fear and pain, and Elijah hears a roaring wind. But God isn't in the wind. And Elijah hears a rumbling earthquake, but God isn't in the earthquake. And Elijah hears a crackling fire, but God isn't in the fire. Remember that Elijah hears the voice of God in what? In the sound of sheer silence. At the points when we're terrified, the points when we're awed, at the points where we don't know what to say, sometimes it's best to say nothing, to listen for God. Because when we're frightened, God is talking, so hush. When we're overwhelmed, God is with us, so pay attention. When we're touched by the holy, when God is showing us something that we don't understand, we don't need to build a memorial. We don't need to convene a task force and issue reports. We don't need to go on TV and talk about it. We don't need to go online and blog about it. We need to stop and look and listen to the reality that God has placed right in front of our faces. The reality of Sunday morning in Lexington on Trent Boulevard. Maybe if we can just shut up for a minute, we'll hear God's voice in the silence. Amen.